Danny is an ethnographer specialized in human, non-human social relations. He teaches anthropology and gender studies on an adjunct basis to the community college students of San Francisco Bay Area. Today, Danny's going to talk to us about affective gradualism, tracing continuities across time, uncovering ethical treasures. So over to you.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Well, yeah, so this is something quite different, I guess. So what I'm going to talk about, the thing I've been calling affective gradualism, is potentially a research method, but it's not a data producing method. Uh, Rather, you can think of it in two ways. One way is that it is an empirical but also speculative framework for understanding how people charge landscapes and time with meaning. Specifically, I like to talk about the origins of awe and terror in time. You can also think of this as a pedagogical framework for transmitting experiences that are actually familiar to geoscientists like most of you, but may seem strange to the public. And the goal of transmitting these experiences would be to introduce people to new orientations in time, specifically in deep time, in order to give them new ethical awarenesses and the basis for making different ethical decisions as collectives and as individuals. And hopefully, one of the things that we can do with this is we can think about how to take field schools and sites of geotourism as cultural interventions in order to produce more operational or more useful ethics, I should say. So the problem that got me thinking about this came to me from a geologist named Marcia Bjornerud in her 2016 book, Timefulness, where she wrote that the citizens of modern industrial nations suffer from time denial. And it's not really quite time denial. Nobody is disbelieving in the passage of time. What what it is it's a poverty, right? It's a temporal monoculture that people are made subject to, uh, made subject to particular kinds of experiences of time, such as time is money that overrides other ways of relating to time, right? If time is money, then time is reduced down to a resource, and we tend to make our decisions within a framework, a temporal framework that serves the individual lifetimes that are doing things like gathering up wealth, right? And so what Bjornerud suggested is that we need more ways to introduce people to deep time. And so as to introduce them to different frameworks for their decision making. So I got into it that way, and this is the direction I took it. I started hanging out with dinosaur scientists, paleontologists, and other people involved with dinosaurs, starting in about 2019 in Montana and Wyoming, both secular paleontologists and some creationist folks up in Montana. And what I did with those folks is I observed students and tourists, like myself, a student and a tourist, as they acquired sensory skills, such as how to spot fossils in the landscape, as well as somatic skills, bodily skills on how to handle fossils. And for instance, in this picture, we see one of the paleontologists at the Glen Rock Paleontological Museum in Wyoming, Stewart, explaining to John with his body how to move a Triceratops femur out of the pit. It's down there. You can't see it quite. And what this has allowed me to do is to trace the origins of the awe that these folks feel for dinosaurs specifically and deep time more generally. Now, I want to say that awe and terror, these experiences we can have in deep time, are matters of affect. They're not things that we can transmit using just data. So, what is affect? Well, affect is a term that is getting thrown around in social sciences and humanities a lot these days. And the most useful definition that I have of it comes from Brian Masumi's 1987 translation of Deleuze and Guattari's 10,000 Plateaus, which is a work of philosophy and psychology and economics and so much else. And Masumi says that affect is a prepersonal intensity, so something arising from the body without thought, that implies an augmentation or diminution in a body's capacity to act. What that means is it's a way that bodies have of establishing the parameters of social behavior. So you can look at these two photographs of me in my socks and my overalls at home. And you can imagine seeing this dude here in these two postures at a restaurant or on a bus. And you can imagine how these two postures, these two affects, would open up certain relationships that you could have with this person and foreclose others, right? You might not want to sit beside me if I'm doing the man spread on the bus, like in the right photo. And you might find it easier to approach me if I'm sort of tidy and prim, right? Although you could have other experiences of those. So that's essentially what affect is. It's embodied and therefore also empirical ways of establishing parameters around our social behavior, and that would include our ethical decisions. I want to say also that landscapes have affects. And of course, these are charged up by culture, right? But they also circumscribe or promote different behaviors. So you can see these three landscapes that I have photographed here. And I suppose a lot of people would find these three scenes rather spooky, but others also find them beautiful. I think each of them would be a nice place to have a picnic. Berkeley Pit in particular is someplace I'm interested in doing some research on, but I'll talk about what that would look like later. The main point here is that these landscapes also have a role in social relationships, and that role is partially determined through our cultural and personal sensibilities. Last point I want to make before I tell you a story is that time itself is an affective experience. As you probably know, we don't have any way of sensing time. We don't have any time sensing organs. We just have our brains that infer time. And our brains infer the passage of time by observing the interactions between bodies. And so those bodies can be you and another person. Those bodies can be you and a clock on the wall. Those bodies can be bodies within yourself, such as in a quiet moment if you get to listen to your own heartbeat. It could be you at the edge of the Grand Canyon observing the absence of material and the great space that's created that way, or you could be stuck in the doctor's office with a boring magazine. But in any case, time is an effect of the interaction of bodies. And what we need to do if we want to change people's experiences of time is we need to curate these kinds of affective experiences. We need to mind the interactions of bodies, specifically the interactions of people and landscapes. And so I have an example of this for you. I got this in the first year of my research on this topic in 2019, or maybe it was 2020. But I was speaking with a paleoanthropology student named Tim Fry at a dinosaur site in Wyoming. And he told me about an experience he had at Lake Turkana in Kenya, which is an important site of paleoanthropology. And I don't have a picture of Lake Turkana. I've never been there, but you can just look at this picture of Fossil Butte in Wyoming, which is also hot and dry and flat, and you can do some imaginative work with that. Or if you like, you can close your eyes while I read. Okay, I'm going to read a story to you now. So, one hot afternoon, Tim retreated from the heat of the midday sun by taking siesta beneath a tree. This behavior would have been typical not only of the people who live and work at Lake Turkana today, but also of generations of humanity who had dwelt in that same area for 2 million years or more. Opening his eyes from his nap, Tim found himself confused, as one might be awakening in a hotel room. He looked upon a world that was functionally similar to prehistoric Turkana, and he briefly had the sensation that he had slipped backwards in time. The affective attributes of the environment, the heat and the shade, the exhaustion, thirst, dust, and the appealing contrast of shadow and light, drew Tim down the trunk of our family tree and into sympathy with the ancestors. Time had deformed around Tim multiple times. by association with paleontologists versed in deep time, and then through the disassociating technologies of air travel, Tim had been wrested from the schedules of undergraduate study in the US and thrust into a world with markedly different tempos. Once he had been integrated into the rhythms of digging at Turkana, time shifted around him again as the local conditions at Turkana introduced him to an imperfect incontinuity with Homo habilis, that's a human ancestor. Homo habilis would have been strange to us, but they had hands and tools, and they walked on two legs. And like their own ancestors, the ancient humans of Turkana would have gotten hot under the sun, and they would have welcomed, just as Tim had, a retreat into the shade and safety of the trees. So, in that story, which I got from Tim Fry, as he was standing over some footprints. No, actually, he was with a Diplodocus skeleton at the time he told me this story. But that story demonstrates three key elements for investigation. If we want to understand the origins of our orientations in time or the origins of affect and landscape, but also three key elements for communicating uh, deep time experiences to the public. And those are a body. Tim's body was in sympathy with past organisms. He could feel like the Homo habilis would have felt. A landscape. Tim was in a landscape that demonstrated continuities through deep time with past landscapes and a curatorial framework, right? And that was, in this case, Tim's geoscience and paleoanthropology education. And these three things together allowed Tim to feel his place in deep time. Now, I think also we can apply this framework to thinking about the future, right? We can use it to help people to feel the future now as it is. And we can use these same three elements, right? We can investigate and communicate about how to sympathize with beings that are far away from us in time, whether that's ancient life forms who had experiences that are actually somewhat similar to our own lived experiences, or weird future beings, future archaeologists and future paleontologists, or even stranger aliens. The second element is a question of how do we make today's landscapes meaningful? How do we make people understand that these are tomorrow's archives? Or how do we make people understand that there is continuity between the past and the present? And then that third element is to give folks frameworks, or rather to understand how they acquire frameworks that allow them or disallow them to speculate from empirical grounds about the futures and the past of the landscapes. And that's what I have for you. If you like, this little sentence at the end summarizes everything. But I suppose there's enough time for questions now.